This morning we're back in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 3. The title of the sermon today is Leaders in the Church. In this passage, Paul gives several qualifications for two types of church leaders. First, overseers in verses 1 through 7, and then deacons in verses 8 through 13. And one of the interesting things about these lists of qualifications is that the lists are almost entirely about character. That doesn't mean that skills are unimportant, but it does mean that character is more important. So in this letter to Timothy, the Apostle Paul, one of the things we've seen, he repeatedly talks about how a Christian should live a life shaped by the gospel. Now, what does that mean? Well, for example, if I believe that I am saved by God's grace, that He has been kind to me in a way that I don't deserve, then that'll change the way, for example, I think about service. It will not be merely a duty to serve the Lord, it will be a delight or a desire. It'll also affect the way that we interact with others if we believe that we're saved by God's grace alone. If God has been gracious to me, I should be gracious to them. I should be kind to them even if they don't really deserve it. So we should live as Christians gospel-shaped lives. What we believe should affect how we live. Now, if that's true of every Christian, that we are to live a life shaped by the gospel, then it's especially true for church leaders. So let's get into the passage. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. Now, it's kind of an unusual sermon to preach because obviously not everyone is a church leader. But I think it's good to look at a passage such as this one. First of all, because I think what is said here about the character of a church leader really, for the most part, should be true about every Christian. We should be people of character. And secondly, since this isn't really a topic that's often discussed on a Sunday morning, I think there's a lot of unclearness in the minds of Christians about the topic of church leaders. So let's see what the Apostle Paul has to say about the qualifications for overseers and deacons. Verse 1, chapter 3. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So, let's consider, first of all, the overseers. Overseer is is not a title that we often use in Baptist churches for a church leader. If the King James Version is your version of choice, you'll notice that it has the word bishop rather than overseer. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the King James Version was written for, or translated for, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and they have bishops, and a bishop has authority over a group of churches in a certain area, a diocese. We don't do that as Baptist churches, and I don't think that that really is the meaning here of an overseer. So what is an overseer? Well, let's go to Acts chapter 20 to answer that question. What is an overseer? In Acts chapter 20, verse 17, Paul calls the elders of the church in Ephesus, to come to him. And down in verse 28, he says to them, "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock," the church, "in which the Holy Spirit has made you" what? Overseers. To do what? To care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. So, what Paul says there is that the elders of the church have been made overseers. And what they are to do is to care for the church. Now, the Greek word that has been translated in the English Standard Version, care for, means to shepherd. And if you look up the origin of the word pastor, you'll discover that it comes from the Latin word pastor, which means shepherd. So in the New Testament, when it talks about church leaders being shepherds, that really means as well pastors. So to shepherd or to pastor really means the same thing. Really, pastor is more of a job description than it is a title for a church leader in the New Testament. So when you put all of that together, what is said in Acts chapter 20, what you see is that overseer, elder, and pastor are different terms for the same office. That would be the office that I hold in this church. I am a pastor, or you could also call me an overseer or an elder. 3 different terms for the same office. Let's look for that in another passage, 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. So look for those 3 terms. They might be in a slightly different form, but look for elder, pastor, or shepherd, and overseer. 1 Peter 5, the Apostle Peter writes, "I exhort the elders among you." So he's addressing the elders of a certain church. He says in verse 2, "Shepherd," or pastor, "the flock of God that is among you," doing what? Exercising oversight. So that is the verb form of the word overseer. So again, we have really all 3 terms together in that passage: elder, pastor or shepherd, and overseer. So, in our church, we believe in a plurality of elders. In some Baptist churches, many Baptist churches, I grew up in a church that had just a single pastor and then a board of deacons. But we believe in a plurality of elders. And there is a distinction we'll get to this eventually in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 17, where it talks about certain elders who labor in preaching and teaching, which seems to imply that not every elder in a church has a ministry really of preaching and teaching. We're told that they're to be able to teach, but it seems that what was happening in Paul's day was that there were maybe one or two or more elders who did the majority of the preaching and teaching. So that's what happens here in our church. I do this full time. I am what they call the pastor, but really, I am an elder, overseer, pastor, or in other words, shepherd. So what this means is that it's incorrect, really, biblically, to think of the elders and the pastor as holding two different offices. There are not two different offices, pastor and elders. That is the same office. I am an elder of this church. I might be the teaching elder, but it's not two different offices or positions. It is one. I don't know if we can ever fully get people to think like that in a Baptist church, but the other elders of this church, Mo and John, really, biblically, you should consider them pastors of the church. And I talked about in one of our meetings how maybe we should start calling the elders the pastor of maybe Christian education or the pastor of visitation to help us get into our minds that the elders, not just me, all of us are pastors. We're to shepherd this church together. So that is what an overseer is. It's an elder. It's a pastor. It's the leader or the leaders of a church. Now, if you just look at the titles or the terms, overseer and deacon, you can get a good idea as to what an overseer and deacon are to do. Basically, an overseer oversees what goes on in a church. The writer of Hebrews tells his readers in Hebrews 13, verse 17, that their leaders keep watch over their souls. So an overseer is to act like a shepherd, keeping watch over the flock, over the church, looking for ways to help the sheep, to lead, to feed, to protect the sheep. So an overseer basically oversees. A deacon, the Greek word for deacon really means literally servant. A deacon is a servant. A deacon serves the church, more of in a support role. The deacons, I see it as assisting the elders. So, for example, a year ago, when all of this happened, when we couldn't meet together, we as elders and deacons, we met together, and the elders, we said we'd like to start a live stream, and the deacons, especially Jacob, took that on and supported the vision of having a live stream. So it's just one way in which the deacons can serve the church by supporting and assisting the vision of the elders, and we can do that in all sorts of ways. It's not clearly stated how to do that in the New Testament, but I think ideally that is how it's supposed to work together. The wives are mentioned not in relation to the overseers or elders, but with the qualifications of the deacons, and there's a big debate there as to whether this is a separate position or whether these are the wives. I think it's more natural to think of or to see this as referring to the wives of the deacons, and I think my theory is that they worked together in those days as a team, and so Paul mentions the wives as well, and which would be a good practice for us to do really today as well. So, overseers and deacons. So, when you look at the lists, the qualifications, when you really compare the two, the main difference is that an overseer is to be able to teach. So the elders are involved in the teaching ministry of the church, and the deacons are there to support them in caring for the flock. Now, there's always lots of interest in the phrase, the husband of one wife, in verse to. What does that mean? Well, I don't believe it means that an overseer, I'll use the term overseer rather than elder or pastor because that's the term we have here in 1 Timothy chapter 3. I don't believe that means that an overseer must be married. At this time, Paul himself might not have been married. So it's not saying that an overseer has to be married. I also don't believe it's saying that an overseer can't be a widower who eventually remarries and has a second wife. What I see this as meaning is, well, really, if you get into the original Greek, literally, it's talking about being of one woman man. Put that together, a one woman man or a one wife husband. And so I see this as referring to faithfulness. Again, this is all about character. And what I see this qualification meaning is that an overseer, an elder, a pastor is to be faithful to his wife, if he has one. Marital faithfulness. So, we don't really have time to go through every single qualification for an overseer or an elder, overseer or deacon this morning. I'd probably be here all day if that were the case. But I just want to make really two observations. And these things can be applied really to any Christian, I believe. But it's especially true, these things are especially true of church leaders. So first of all, a church leader should be someone who aspires to humble service. You notice the word aspires in verse 1. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Well, this aspiration, it's not a selfish one. It is an aspiration or desire for the right reasons. A person should not desire a leadership position in the church as a way to gain status or control. In many churches, there's a board, whether it's a board of deacons or a board of elders, and they are just decision makers. They just are there to decide what goes on in the church. But what I see as biblical is that a group of elders or overseers are to see this as taking on a responsibility, taking on a ministry. They are ministers, not really lords over the church. So, aspiring to humble service. Notice that it says in verse 3 that he should not be a lover of money, the overseer. And a deacon should not be greedy for dishonest gain, verse 8. And so, taking on one of these positions, it's not about what I can gain personally from it. It's how I can serve the church. We're to follow the example of Jesus, who was a servant leader. He came into the world, he said, not to be served, but to serve. And we know that the ultimate act of sacrifice of Jesus was when he gave himself for us, gave his life up for us by dying on a cross. And so a church leader should first of all be someone who aspires to humble service. Not for control, not for status, not for some other selfish reason, but for humble service, to be like Jesus, to lead like him. And then secondly, a church leader should be someone who values character more than charisma. I mentioned this already, that the lists of qualifications for both overseers and deacons are mostly about character. Doesn't mean that charisma isn't good, but what it's saying is that character is more important. And really, when you look at the qualifications for an overseer, really the key qualification is that he must be above reproach. Obviously, that doesn't mean perfection, or else there would be no overseers. No one would be qualified. But it's talking about some obvious flaw of character. And you could go through that list of qualifications, and you can see areas of weakness, I'm sure, for any overseer. But there should be no real obvious flaw in character that would disqualify someone from being an overseer, or in other words, as we've seen, a pastor or elder. Above reproach. Again, it's talking about our character. Verse 7 says that the deacon must be, the overseer must be well thought of by outsiders, by people outside the church. You know, people outside the church aren't really impressed by charisma without character. You know, there are many church leaders who, unfortunately, very sadly, fail in some way, and they might have lots of charisma, but they've shown a flaw in character. And by God's grace, apart from God's grace, that could happen to any one of us. But the world really isn't impressed by charisma without character, but really the opposite. Character with not much charisma can gain the respect of the world. And so again, character is more important. One of the things that Paul says in 1 Timothy more than once is that he's concerned about the reputation of the church, Christians, by those outside the church, by the unsaved, unbelievers. It's one of his big concerns for the people, for the church in Ephesus. Back in chapter 2, Paul writes that he desires that they lead a peaceful and quiet life, verse 2, godly and dignified in every way. What that's talking about is observable behavior. He's talking about what those outside the church see in us. And that's in the context in chapter 2 about praying for all people and God desiring all people to be saved and how the gospel is for everyone. And so that's one of his concerns in this letter, that we would live in such a way that we would make the gospel attractive to those outside the church. And here in chapter 3, he mentions that an overseer should be well thought of by outsiders. And the deacons in verse 13, he talks about gaining a good standing for themselves. And I believe that means a good standing with others. Again, the reputation of these leaders. And not only true for leaders, but it's true for all of us. Especially church leaders, of course, but it's to be true for all of us that we are to live in such a way that we do not bring disrepute upon the church and upon the gospel and upon Jesus Christ. Whether we're leaders or not, we are to live lives shaped by the gospel. What we believe should affect how we live. Is that how we lived this past week? Well, may it be our desire this week to live lives shaped by the gospel, whether we're leaders or not.